It is a Tuesday morning in March of 1955 in a brick-fronted diner on Market Street in a small city in Pennsylvania, and a woman named Peggy is tying her apron. She is 26 years old in her second year as a waitress at the counter. The diner opens at 6. She arrived at 5:30 to roll silverware into napkins, refill the sugar dispensers, wipe down the ketchup bottles, and start the coffee. The first regular through the door at 6:02 will be the night watchman from the courthouse across the street, ordering 2 eggs over easy, bacon, white toast, and coffee, the way he has every working morning for years. By 6:30, Peggy will have served 16 breakfasts, called 12 orders to the cook through the pass-through window, refilled the coffee pot twice, and pocketed her first tips of the morning. This is a countdown of 12 of the rules she lived under. Stay with me, because the rule at number 1 was the one that explained why every other rule on this list mattered so much. For roughly 15 years after the Second World War, the American downtown diner waitress worked under a code that was thinner on paper than viewers might expect. The rules were not in a training binder. They were in the diner's owner, in the cook through the pass-through, in the regulars at the counter, and in the cash drawer at the end of the shift, and breaking any one of them could cost her a week's groceries. Let's begin with the rule that explained the rest. Number 12. The wage and the tips. On a slow Tuesday afternoon at the end of the lunch shift, Peggy counted the tips in her apron pocket at the register and stacked them on the counter for Mr. Hill, the owner, to see. $3.40. Most checks had been 30 to 60 cents. The tips on them had been nickels and dimes, with the occasional quarter from a regular. The salesman was the difference between a good day and a bad one, and he had not come in that Tuesday. Peggy walked the 340 home. Wednesday morning before her shift, she stopped at the grocery store down the block. The 340 bought a half-pound of bacon, a loaf of bread, a can of soup, and a quart of milk, and a bad week's groceries was already in front of her. Her cash wage at the diner in 1955 was somewhere between 40 cents and 60 cents an hour. The federal minimum wage at the time was $1 an hour, raised that year from 75 cents, but restaurant workers were excluded from federal minimum wage coverage. The exclusion was not corrected until the 1966 amendments to the Fair Labor Standards Act, which also, for the first time, created the federal tipped wage as a separate concept. In Peggy's diner in 1955, the cash wage was the floor. The tips were the income. The labor historian Dorothy Sue Cobble, in her 1991 study of waitresses, documented that the cash wage was deliberately kept low because the tips were expected to carry the earnings. Every other rule on this list, the smile, the dress, the constant warmth, served the rule beneath them. The customer who left was the customer who tipped or the customer who did not. Number 11. The standing shift. Peggy worked breakfast through the lunch rush, 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, on her feet for 8 hours. The waitresses on the evening shift, 3 to 11, worked another 8. On Saturdays, when the diner stayed open until midnight, the morning shift came back at 6 on Sunday for the church crowd. At 2 in the afternoon, when Peggy tied her apron in the back room and walked home, the first thing she did when she unlocked her apartment door was sit down on the kitchen chair just inside the doorway and take her shoes off. She would not stand up again for 45 minutes. She soaked her feet in a basin of warm water and Epsom salt on the linoleum floor, while the coffee she had drunk at noon was still in her bloodstream and the smoke from the diner was still in her hair. The burns on her forearms from the coffee pot and from the grill window were treated with a tin of bag balm on the kitchen windowsill. The cuts on her hands from broken glassware and the bread knife were small enough that she did not bother with bandages. In the evenings, when she rolled her stockings off, she saw the veins in her calves that worried her. Peggy knew by 26 what her legs were going to look like at 50. Number 10. The pass-through. The window between the counter and the kitchen was 12 inches high, 4 feet wide, and the most contested 12 square feet of the diner. The cook stood on the other side of it. Peggy wrote each order on a carbon copy ticket, called the order out loud, 2 over easy, bacon crisp, white down, side of hash, and slid the ticket through. The cook called back when the plate was up. The sociologist William Foote White, in a 1948 study called Human Relations in the Restaurant Industry, documented the pass-through as the central conflict zone of the American diner. The waitress was paid in tips. The cook was paid a flat wage. The waitress needed her orders fast. The cook needed her orders in the order he could fill them. In Peggy's diner, the cook was a man named Frank, 20 years on a grill, and Peggy had learned in her first month which orders to call in which sequence to keep him on her side. The pass-through was not just a window, it was a daily negotiation in 12 square feet of stainless steel. Number 9. The uniform. Peggy's uniform was a pale blue cotton dress with a white collar, a white half apron tied at the waist, white hose, polished white Oxfords, and a small white cap pinned to her hair. The dress was hers. She owned 3 of them, rotated them through the week, and laundered them at home on Sundays. The apron was the diner's. Her name was embroidered in red thread above the apron pocket. Inside the apron pocket, she carried an order pad, a pencil, a notebook for the regulars' tabs, and the cash from closed checks. Her hair was pinned off the collar, partly because the state health code asked for it, and partly because the owner asked for it. The makeup was light. The lipstick was red. On Sunday afternoons, the kitchen sink filled with hot water and borax, and the 3 uniforms came out one at a time. Coffee stains and grease spots were scrubbed from the cuffs and apron pockets, each piece wrung out and hung on the clothesline in the alley behind the building. On Sunday evenings, the ironing board came out of the closet and the aprons and dresses were pressed for the week. Mr. Hill noticed wrinkles. Edith noticed wrinkles. A wrinkle in Peggy's apron on a Monday morning was a comment from Edith at the door. The uniform was not a costume. It was the visible part of the discipline. And the discipline started on Sunday at the kitchen sink. Number 8. The cleanliness rule. By 10 in the morning, Peggy's apron had to look the way it had looked at 6. Mr. Hill walked the floor twice a shift, and a stain on the apron was a reason for him to comment. The waitresses who lasted at the diner kept a clean spare apron in the back, folded and ready to change into before the lunch rush. A customer who set his coffee cup down too hard at the counter, who splashed the coffee across the front of Peggy's apron in a brown half moon, would get a smile, a quick "don't worry about it," and his check finished. Peggy would walk to the back room. She would change the apron in under a minute. By the time the next regular sat down at the counter, the new apron was tied, and the old one was soaking in cold water in the back sink, and the regular did not know anything had happened. The dish she had carried from the pass-through to table 4 had to arrive at the table without a thumbprint on the rim of the plate. The coffee she had poured into the cup at table 7 had to arrive without a drip on the saucer. The cleanliness rule was not a customer rule. It was the rule the customer would not notice, and would notice if it failed. Number 7. The hair, the dress, the door. Peggy's first morning at the diner, Mr. Hill's wife, Edith, stood at the door and looked Peggy over from the hair down. The hair was pinned. The dress was pressed. The shoes were polished. The lipstick was on. Edith did not say anything. She nodded and let Peggy through. The inspection happened every morning for Peggy's first month and once a week after that. The dress code was not a written code. It was the owner's wife at the door with the unsmiling face. A dress Edith did not approve of was a dress Peggy did not wear to the diner again. The hair pinned off the collar was technically a state health code matter, but the code's strict requirement fell on the cook on the other side of the pass-through. For the waitress, the hair rule was Edith at the door. The line between law and Edith's preference was not a line either of them needed to draw. We are halfway down. The next rules go deeper, and the rule at number 1 will explain why Peggy's career ended in a building that is no longer there. Number 6. The lingo. Peggy called orders to Frank through the pass-through in a verbal shorthand that had developed in American diners across 40 years. 2 eggs poached on toast was Adam and Eve on a raft. A hamburger on the grill was burn one. With lettuce, tomato, and onion was drag it through the garden. A glass of milk was moo juice. Pancakes were a stack. A short stack was 3. To go was on wheels. Out of an item, or strike it from the order, was 86. The shorthand was not written down anywhere. It was learned at the pass-through from the cook and from the other waitresses in the first month on the job. Peggy learned hers the same way. The first time she called an order through the window for 2 poached eggs on toast, she said the order in plain English. Frank stopped what he was doing on the grill. He looked at her through the window for 2 long seconds. Then he said, without smiling, "Adam and Eve on a raft." Peggy repeated it back. Frank turned to the grill. The next time she called a poached egg order, 3 minutes later, she called it correctly. The lingo was practical. It was faster to call across a noisy kitchen than the full order. It was also a sign. A waitress who used the lingo well was a waitress who had been at the counter long enough to belong. A waitress who used it badly was new, and the regulars at the counter noticed. Number 5. The regulars. The night watchman from the courthouse came at 6:02. The ticket clerk from the train station came at 6:40 with the morning paper folded under his arm. The 2 patrolmen from the Market Street beat came at 7:15 after their shift change. The traveling salesman who covered the wholesale hardware route came on Tuesdays and Fridays. The 2 retired bookkeepers who lived in the rooming house down the block came every morning at 9 and stayed until 10:30 drinking refills. Peggy knew their names. She knew their orders. She knew which of them ran a tab in the small lined notebook in her apron pocket and which of them paid cash. She knew which of them tipped well, which tipped little, and which tipped nothing. And she was friendly to all of them because the ones who tipped nothing today might tip tomorrow. And the ones who tipped well today might be slow on a Friday in a month when the wholesale orders were down. The regulars were the income. The strangers were the bonus. Peggy poured the night watchman's coffee before he asked for it every morning for 2 years. Number 4. The deference rules. The customer was always right. The customer was sir or ma'am, never anything else. The customer who asked for the eggs cooked harder than Frank had cooked them got the eggs cooked harder, with a smile, with no comment. The customer who complained that the coffee was too weak got fresh coffee, with a smile, with no comment. The customer who put his hand on Peggy's wrist as she set down the check got a smile, and Peggy moved her hand without comment. Mr. Hill was not called over for the wrist. Mr. Hill was called over only for the customer who would not leave, or the customer who became physical. Everything below that line Peggy handled. The smile did not break. The voice did not rise. The next customer was already at the counter. The deference was not a feeling. It was the visible part of the labor. Number 3. The station and the seniority. The diner had 18 seats at the counter and 6 booths. The counter was divided into 3 stations of 6 seats each. The booths were a 4th station. The senior waitress, a woman named Dolores who had worked at the diner for 5 years, had the booths and the 4 counter seats closest to the door, the best tips, the regulars, the steady traffic. The second most senior waitress had the middle counter station. Peggy, in her 2nd year, had the back counter, the 6 seats closest to the kitchen, the stretch where the smoke from the grill hit hardest and the regulars sat least. New waitresses had no station and floated. A new hire who tried to take a booth heard about it from Dolores at the end of the shift. The station was the visible form of how long a waitress had been there, and the income difference between Dolores's station and Peggy's station was real money over a month. Number 2, the tip in practice. On a Tuesday afternoon, a few weeks after the slow shift that left her with $3.40 in tips, the traveling salesman who covered the wholesale hardware route left a $1 tip on a $1.20 check at her station. Peggy walked the dollar home. The next morning before her shift, she stopped at the grocery store down the block and bought enough groceries to last most of the week, 3 times what $3.40 had bought her 2 weeks earlier. The customer who left a dime on a 40-cent check had tipped 1/4 of the bill, which by the 1950s standard was generous. A customer who left nothing was a customer, Peggy remembered. In Peggy's diner, on a good Saturday, the tips on her station added up to $9 or $10 by the end of the shift. The customer who flirted and tipped well was a customer she remembered. The customer who lingered, ordered a refill, asked about her family, and left a dime on a 60-cent check was a customer she remembered differently. The 2 retired bookkeepers who came every morning at 9 were not generous tippers, and they sat at Peggy's station because no one else would have them for 90 minutes over refills. The traveling salesman was a generous tipper, and he sat at Peggy's station even when there were seats open at Dolores's. The economics of every customer at every seat were live in Peggy's head at all times. The smile she gave the dime tipper was the same smile she gave the salesman. The income was not the same. Which brings us to number 1, the rule beneath every other rule on this list, and the rule that explained by the end of Peggy's career why the diner she walked into in 1955 was not there anymore. Number 1, the job was disappearing. By the late 1960s, the cook Frank's son was the assistant manager of a McDonald's franchise in a strip mall on the edge of town. The traveling salesman who covered the wholesale hardware route was making his rounds on the new interstate and stopping at the new Howard Johnson's on the off-ramp. The night watchman at the courthouse had retired. The 2 retired bookkeepers were no longer at the counter. The independent downtown diner Peggy worked in was a business model the country was actively eliminating, one off-ramp at a time. The signing date had been June 29th of 1956. That was 15 months after the Tuesday morning Peggy tied her apron. The Federal Aid Highway Act authorized $25 billion for 41,000 miles of interstate highway, designed to route long-distance traffic around the downtowns of America's small cities rather than through them. The waitresses who lived through it knew, by the mid-1960s, that they were among the last of something, often without anyone in the diner saying it out loud. That was the rule beneath every other rule. The wage, the tips, the smile, the lingo, the regulars, the seniority, all of it was the discipline required of a profession the country was eliminating. Peggy worked at the Market Street Diner for 9 more years. When it closed, she walked past the boarded-up Market Street storefront once a week until the building was torn down. If this story reminded you of someone, a mother, an aunt, a wife who came home with the smell of coffee and grease in her hair after an 8-hour shift, send it along. There is more forgotten, honest history like this waiting for you. The next story is ready when you are.